Welcome to Humane Voices, the official podcast of the Humane Society of the United States. On today's episode, we're talking about one of the elements on the periodic table, if we're flashing back to elementary school or high school, lead. It is heavy and soft, and it's unfortunately toxic. I mean, I think we've all heard about like lead paint back in the day, and lead in drinking water. That was in the news a few years ago with Flint, Michigan, suffering so much.
Still going on, I think.
Yeah, still going on. But also hunters use lead ammunition while hunting. I mean, I read online, for what that's worth, about 9 billion bullets are manufactured every year, and 90% of them are come from at least partly made of lead. I mean, what does this mean for animals and people? We've got a couple experts on just that subject to talk to us and get to the bottom of the issue. We've got Jill Fritz, Senior Director of Wildlife Protection at the Humane Society of the United States, and Jillian Lyons, Director of Regulatory Affairs at the Humane Society Legislative Fund. Welcome, you guys.
Thanks for having us.
And Carrie, my co-host, as always, how are you?
I'm good, and I'm just hoping that this whole episode doesn't go down like a lead balloon.
There we go.
Yeah,
perfect.
So, before we even get into it, I thought we should acknowledge, coming right out of the gate, this sort of inherent irony of discussing whether, like the safety of bullets, right? I think it's probably clear to everybody that bullets are bad for you, but maybe Jill, you can start off giving us a sort of broader context about this issue, because really what we're talking about here, I mean, obviously, a bullet is bad for a person or an animal that it strikes, but what we're really talking here is the effect of bullets well beyond the animals who are being like directly hunted with them. And even though it impacts them, there's a much broader sort of sphere of harm that's created by the use of lead in this ammunition. So maybe you could talk us through a little bit about that history.
Certainly. Yes. Well, as you mentioned, lead ammunition itself and lead tackle used for fishing are highly toxic to wildlife. And they're exposed to it in various ways. It could be feeding and scavenging on the lead-tainted gut piles or carcasses that are left behind by hunters, or the animals may forage the spent lead shot that's on the ground, or aquatic wildlife can directly consume spent lead fishing tackle. So in birds, even a single ingested shotgun pellet or bullet fragment is enough to cause brain damage and impair critical neuromuscular, auditory, visual responses. So what's particularly insidious is that even if these animals survive that initial lead poisoning, those visual and hearing impairments and that disorientation makes them more susceptible to dangers like car collision or predation. So in 1991, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually did phase out the use of lead shot when hunting migratory waterfowl, because it was estimated at that time that about 2 million ducks were dying every year from ingesting those spent lead pellets.
So why isn't that? I mean, like, to me, it's sort of clear why that's not enough. It's like, like migratory waterfowl is just one category of animal. Like, why has the problem kind of remained, and why is it still out there?
Well, I can say that, and I know Jillian can talk a lot more about efforts at the federal level, but the HSUS has been working on this for a long time, for decades, as far back as 1973. We joined with the National Parks and Conservation Association to petition the Department of the Interior to ban lead shot nationally. And that petition was rejected, but since then we've submitted additional petitions to the federal government, and we've been working with state agencies and wildlife or environmental groups and wildlife rehabilitators to educate the public and hunters about the toxic effects of lead ammo. And we also have supported policy advancements. There have been some big changes. The California ban on the use of lead ammunition and tackle that just went into effect, and the 2016 federal ban on all national wildlife refuges of the use of lead ammunition, although that was repealed by the Trump administration soon afterwards. But every step along the way, and I know Jillian can elaborate on this, we're met with mainly opposition from extremely powerful and influential hunting and weapons lobby groups.
Yeah, I think that that's really the sort of crux of the issue that Jill hit upon, is there has been pretty tacit acknowledgement from the federal government and from, scientists at large that lead ammunition and lead tackle has cascading effects in the ecosystems. That's something the federal government recognizes. But, when you're thinking about the interplay of issues, we're obviously on the side of thinking that lead ammunition should be phased out and banned. There are other environmental groups, wildlife groups, all of these different kind of groups that work on this issue. But the flip side is, of course, there are large groups, hunting organizations, the NRA, that sort of work on the other side of this issue that want that lead ammunition available to hunters. So I think we're sort of, in this moment in time, which has been happening over the past decade of, it's a real discussion at the federal level, and everything takes a little bit of time to sort of happen, but it feels like maybe we're at a tipping point and we're at a time where it looks like we are starting to move in a positive direction on this. So hopefully the decades of work that Jill has mentioned, including, a 2014 petition we submitted to the government asking for a phase out, hopefully we're at that time where in the next few years, the next decade, we're really going to see that take hold and start to fully phase this out.
And so Jillian or Jill, the argument for keeping lead shot or lead ammunition is mainly about cost. Is that right?
Yes, that's what we have seen. These large hunting groups make their objections known when they testify or issue statements opposing any new lead bans or regulations that come into effect. For example, in 2021, a bill was introduced in the state of Maine to phase out the use of lead ammunition. And at that time, the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, which is an extremely powerful and large hunting lobby group, claimed that the ban would require retooling of manufacturing equipment to make bullets, and that would cause delays, and it would raise prices, and that would lead to decreased participation in hunting. And importantly, also related spending on hunting equipment. And other opposing groups have made similar arguments, like the NRA, Safari Club International, Sportsmen's Alliance Foundation, National Shooting Sports Foundation. But it's really all about, hey, this is going to cost more for hunters, and so they're not going to bother, and they're not going to go out and hunt.
Interesting. So are there alternatives? Are there available alternatives out there? I mean, it's kind of interesting to me, like we see the progress we've made around something like, I mean, it's not really a corollary, but you see the progress we have made around industry groups that are deciding that, yes, we're going to meet the need for like cage-free eggs. Why is there not a manufacturer out there who sees this as an opportunity to sort of seize a market to create something that is actually better for the environment and the animals that these hunters, many of them, claim to be conservationists?
Yes, well, there are absolutely alternatives. I mean, since the 1991 federal ban on lead shot for hunting waterfowl, they have had to find those alternative bullets since then, and the California lead shot ban that went into effect in 2019. So since those bans, the availability and the performance and the affordability of that non-lead ammunition has definitely increased significantly. And it's not about performance either. There was a survey conducted by the Arizona Game and Fish Commission a few years ago and found that nearly 80% of hunters rated the performance of non-lead ammunition to be better than or the equivalent of lead ammunition.
Okay, so the alternatives are sound like they're just as good. And Jillian, it sounds like there is a movement for, I guess, the federal agencies to try to move away from it. There's some new rebate program. Is that right? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things happening at the federal level, and Jill sort of talked about this history of what has happened at the federal level, but I think it's important for context is that in 2009, National Park Service basically said, we're going to ban lead ammunition, lead tackle on all National Park Service lands. There was pushback, and they subsequently decided not to do that. Similarly, the Fish and Wildlife Service had a director that banned lead on all Fish and Wildlife Service lands. A new director and secretary came in and overturned that. So I think what the federal government has sort of learned from their past mistakes is maybe not the right word, but the past actions that they have taken is that, a very quick outright ban doesn't successfully work. So what they're trying to do now is a couple of things. One, which is a rebate program where they're opening up the hunting season in 2024 for 7 national wildlife refuges. And they're letting hunters and fishers know, if you use NOD, lead ammunition, and tackle on these lands, we'll pay you back for it. Whether it's in the form of a credit card, they're sort of thinking about all of these ways to give those hunters and fishers back their money for buying non-lead ammunition. And simultaneously, what they're going to do with that is they're going to examine how successful the program is, because they're looking at incentives, but they're also looking at how well those incentives work. So if they decide, maybe the credit cards aren't working so well, people want to get paid up front, or people want to get paid on the back end. They're looking at how these incentives are going to work so they can replicate this on federal lands throughout the United States, which is a fantastic way to sort of get at the phase out without doing an outright ban, which can get rid of some of that controversy we were just talking about. One of the other things that they are doing simultaneously is every year they do this sort of examination of hunting and fishing opportunities throughout the United States. And there are certain areas where they decide they're going to open up more hunting or fishing opportunities. What they're doing now is they're saying, okay, here's the flip side. We're going to allow a little bit more hunting on this wildlife refuge, but all of that hunting is going to be tied to lead-free ammunition. So they're looking at sort of 2 ways to do this, of expanding opportunities tied to lead-free and then also giving rebates to hunters that are using lead-free. So they're sort of looking at trying to get creative to get to where we need to be, which is this sort of lead-free world where all of these animals are not dealing with the cascading effects, but they're doing it in a way that sort of hits at what we want as a community, but also what the other sort of Goliath in the room, the hunting community, wants on their side. So it seems like they're really trying to sort of figure out ways, creative ways of thinking to get at something that's better for animals and better for the environment.
Look at the government, creative thinking. Who would have thought? That's awesome.
It doesn't always happen, unfortunately.
I want to get back to the toxicity of this element, lead, that's in this ammunition, and we're obviously coming at it from an animal's perspective, but it's also harmful to people too, right? Jill, can you tell us a little bit? I mean, I think children are one of the groups on the list that it's really affecting kids out there, right?
Right. Well, yes, the Centers for Disease Control classifies lead as a toxic substance, and that toxicity is well known and widely documented in medical literature. But yes, and young children and pregnant women are at most risk from lead poisoning. The CDC and a large consensus of scientists have said that there is no level of lead exposure to children that is safe and does not have harmful effects. I mean, even those low levels can cause developmental delays and learning difficulties, behavioral issues. So, and the connection with lead ammunition is that, of course, consuming the meat of animals killed with lead ammunition is needlessly putting children and adults at risk of lead exposure. And that's because lead ammunition is highly fragmentable. Of course, it's a very soft metal, and it fragments on impact, and it's nearly impossible to remove it completely from meat. So, and it's not just the impact point, but it fragments, some of them too small to be seen with the naked eye, have been found far away from the actual point of impact. So as a result of this, health officials in many states recommend avoiding using lead bullets to hunt wild game, that animal game that you plan to eat. They recommend that pregnant women and children younger than 6 should not eat venison that's hunted with lead ammo, and they advise that game meat that is donated to food banks should not be shot with lead ammunition, or even processed in facilities that they might have lead contamination from other wild killed animals. And then there was also a recent study finding that the use of lead ammunition has been connected with elevated levels of lead in children just in the home.
Wow.
You would think that there'd be a lot of hunters who would be on our side on this one.
It seems like, yeah.
If we're talking about subsistence hunting and people who are hunting to feed their families, I mean, obviously at the Humane Society, I think for sure we've got, mixed feelings about it across our team, but, we don't take a position on food, hunting for food overall. But people who are hunting to feed their families, you think they want to be feeding their families safe food.
Indeed, the state agencies that administer hunters have spoken out about this, as well as state health agencies as well. So, yes,
And
I'm
I
sure
do think there are a lot of hunters that
Yeah.
are on our side on this. Yeah, we shouldn't sort of frame it as an us versus them. There are a ton of hunters. And when we filed our 2014 petition, there were hunters that joined us alongside other wildlife groups and other organizations. So I think there are people on both sides of this issue that really understand that this is just not a safe thing to be entering into the environment.
So how do you guys think that this is going to be impacted by the incoming administration, whoever it turns out to be? I know both of the vice presidential candidates are hunters in the past, at least, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally one of the things that we have learned on the sort of federal political side is there are Democrats and Republicans that care about these issues equally. And one of the things that we have to do is make sure that any incoming administration, be it the Trump-Vance or Harris-Walz, knows that this is a priority issue for a whole scope of Americans. So I think the reality is, we have a chance here, regardless of administration, to keep moving this issue forward, particularly in the way the federal government is trying to do it now, which is sort of meeting both sides of the issue in the middle and finding pathways that everybody can agree on to get towards a phase out. Obviously, we would like it to happen faster. There's probably some in the hunting community that would like it to happen slower, but this is the sort of solution that's gearing towards getting both sides in the middle. So I think we can continue this progress regardless of administration. I do think it's probably a little bit more likely because it was initially the Obama-Biden administration that did an outright ban on lead on all Fish and Wildlife Service lands, and then that was overturned by the Trump administration. I think it's probably much more likely that we would get something like an outright ban if it was a Harris-Walz administration. But you honestly never know. It really is what the public is talking about, what the voters are talking about, what's important to those administrations. So one thing everybody needs to do, regardless of where they are on any side of the issue, is just let their politicians know what's important. And that's what we're going to do on issues like this.
Well, Jillian, your answer sort of leads me to kind of towards the end here. What is it that people can do? Is there something that people can do and make their voices heard on this issue?
So I think there's a lot. One of the things I was just saying in response to Carrie is that people sort of have to think about the issues that they're important to them and then let their representatives, their senators, their administration know what's important. But, just flagging right now, every year, to sort of not get into political semantics that will bore everybody that's listening to the podcast, but every year, the federal government is funded by annual appropriations bills. They come out, they fund every federal agency. And we have a bill right now that has language on the House side, which would stop Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, those federal agencies from banning lead shot on any of their federal lands. So if this is an issue that people are it's important to them, you should keep an eye on our blogs as the appropriations processes are moving. We often have action alerts that are just easy ways. They give you a script, they connect you to your representative, your senator. You can say, hey, I don't want to see this kind of language in my appropriations bills. This is a really important issue to me. So always make sure you're keeping an eye out on the blogs that are coming out of both HSUS and HSLF. And I think Jill has some flags of making sure you talk to your state director. So we're happy to pass over to Jill on that one.
Oh, sure. And I'll just add, you can find our blog at humanesociety.org/blog. And yes, please also contact your HSUS state director, and they can fill you in on what they're doing in your state to protect wildlife. And you can find them at humanesociety.org/states. And your state director can also point you toward our federal affairs team at HSLF, like Jillian, to find out how to support regulations or laws that to reduce the use of lead ammunition, and also, very importantly, to speak out against bad bills or bad regulations that come up, like a bill recently in Congress that has not moved forward, although it did make it in some form into a spending bill recently, that would prohibit federal officials from banning the use of lead ammunition on federal lands. So HSLF can keep you updated on both good and bad things that come up and how you can take action on them.
And the one other thing I will say that sounds silly, but I'm always telling people to do this. You know, when the Fish and Wildlife Service rebate program came out, like, if you're interested in this, just tweeting and saying, thanks, Fish and Wildlife Service. This is a really cool program. It sounds so silly, but all of these government agencies really like positive feedback. So if you see something that you like, sending a tweet, putting a Facebook post, giving some props. Yeah, give them a little pat on the back. It's really helpful for them to actually hear from people when they're excited about things they do, instead of just when you're angry, which is, I think, generally what we do as Americans.
Well, fantastic. Thanks, you guys, for all the important information. We'll contact our state directors and stay informed about everything with this important issue. And that's it for us this week. We will see you next time on Humane Voices.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.